There is a place on earth where God is said to have walked, and a sliver of land where divine promises echo in the very stones. It is a landscape etched with the memories of prophets, kings, and saviors. A spiritual center of gravity for billions of souls across the globe. Yet, for millennia, this same soil has been soaked in more human blood and has witnessed more inconsolable grief than almost any other. How can a land promised as a divine inheritance become the epicenter of humanity's most enduring conflict? How can the cradle of faith become a crucible of war? This is not a story about modern politics, about borders drawn in the 20th century. To understand the wound that will not heal, we must journey back 4,000 years, back to the desert sands of ancient Mesopotamia, where a single promise was made to a single man, a promise that would ignite a fire that still burns today. This is the story of Palestine in the Bible, a story of a holy land and a battleground of empires. Our story begins not in Palestine, but hundreds of miles to the east in the bustling city-state of Ur of the Chaldees, modern-day Iraq. Around 4,000 years ago, a man named Abram, later to be known as Abraham, heard a voice. The book of Genesis tells us it was the voice of God, delivering a command that was both a test and a destiny. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. This was no ordinary migration. It was the beginning of a covenant, a sacred contract between the divine and the mortal. Abraham was to leave behind everything he knew, everything that defined him, and walk towards an unknown horizon. In return, a promise was made, a promise of descendants as numerous as the stars, and a promise of land. When Abraham finally arrived in the land of Canaan, it was not an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was a vibrant, populated region, home to Canaanites, Philistines, and a mosaic of other tribes. It was a land of green pastures and olive groves, but also of harsh, unforgiving droughts. And yet, here, the divine promise was solidified. To your offspring, God declared, I will give this land. Here, in this simple phrase, lies the seed of all future complexity, the word offspring. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, born to his wife's maidservant Hagar, and Isaac, born to his wife Sarah in her old age. From Ishmael, Arab traditions and the Islamic faith trace a noble lineage. From Isaac and his son Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel would emerge. From the very first generation, the question of inheritance was born. The Jewish people believed the covenant passed through Isaac, the son of the promise. Islamic tradition honors Ishmael as a prophet in his own right, forever linking the Arab peoples to the legacy of Abraham. Two peoples, born from one father, would forever lay claim to the same spiritual inheritance and the same piece of earth. The land of Canaan was as fickle as it was beautiful. It was a severe famine that forced Abraham's grandson, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, meaning one who struggles with God, to lead his family into Egypt, seeking survival. This journey into a foreign land was meant to be temporary. It became a 400-year saga of enslavement. One might ask, why would a people, promised a land of their own, be condemned to 4 centuries of bondage under the pharaohs? The biblical narrative offers a profound answer. This was not a punishment, but a forging. In the crucible of slavery, away from the promised land, the scattered descendants of Jacob were hammered into a single unified people. Their identity was sharpened not by geography, but by shared suffering and a shared memory of the promise. The story of their escape, the Exodus led by Moses, is one of the most powerful liberation narratives in human history. It is a journey from bondage to freedom, but more than that, it is a journey home. When Moses stood before the parting of the Red Sea, when he received the 10 Commandments atop the thunderous peak of Mount Sinai, the ultimate destination was never in doubt. It was always Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey, Palestine. But in a poignant twist of fate, Moses, the great liberator, would never set foot in it. He would only gaze upon its beauty from a distance, from the summit of Mount Nebo, before his death. The promise was for the people, not for the man. The task of conquest, of turning the promise into a physical reality, would fall to his successor, Joshua. What followed was not a peaceful settlement. It was a military campaign, a brutal and dramatic chapter in this historical saga. The Bible's book of Joshua describes a series of lightning conquests. The legendary walls of Jericho, the oldest city in the world, crumbled at the sound of trumpets. City-states and local tribes, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, were systematically confronted in bloody battles for control of every valley and every hilltop. It is here we must understand a crucial detail about the name itself. The word Palestine, as we know it today, has its ancient roots in the word Philistia. The Philistines were the sworn enemies of the ancient Israelites. They were a formidable seafaring people, settled along the coastal plain, the very area we now know as Gaza, and armed with advanced iron weaponry. The iconic duel between David and the Philistine giant Goliath was more than a simple tale of courage. It was a powerful symbol of the existential struggle for this land. A clash between an established coastal power and an emerging hill country nation. The historical record and the biblical text sometimes diverge here. While the Bible portrays a swift and total conquest, modern archaeology suggests a more gradual process of settlement and cultural assimilation. Some scholars even propose that the early Israelites were not purely outside invaders, but perhaps a coalition of indigenous Canaanite groups who developed a unique monotheistic identity. Regardless of the precise mechanics of their rise, their emergence fundamentally and permanently altered the destiny of this land. Once the major battles subsided, Joshua undertook the monumental task of dividing the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. This was the moment the abstract promise was translated into a concrete map. Judah, the most powerful tribe, received the southern hills, including the future sites of Jerusalem and Hebron. The fertile central highlands went to Ephraim and Manasseh. Other tribes settled the beautiful northern region of the Galilee. The tribe of Levi, tasked with priestly duties, received no territory, living instead among the others as their spiritual guides. This division wasn't merely administrative. It laid the political and social foundation of the Israelite nation for centuries. But the conquest was incomplete. The Philistines remained masters of the coast. The Jebusites held the impenetrable fortress of Jerusalem. Pockets of Canaanite culture persisted, living alongside the Israelites. This coexistence created a volatile religious and cultural environment. The Israelites were constantly tempted by the local gods, Baal and Asherah, leading to internal strife and a weakening of their covenant faith. This era, the time of the Judges, was a period of chaos and fragmentation. Without a central king, the Bible says, everyone did as they saw fit, and in moments of weakness, their neighbors, especially the Philistines, would rise up, pushing them back into the mountains. The need for unity, for a king to lead them against their enemies, became a desperate cry. The age of kings arrived, but it was under Israel's second king, David, that the promise reached its zenith. David was not just a warrior, he was a political genius. His first masterstroke was conquering the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? It was strategically brilliant. Located on a neutral ridge between the northern and southern tribes, it was a perfect, unifying capital. But David's vision was greater. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the physical manifestation of God's presence, to the city. In that moment, Jerusalem was transformed. It ceased to be just a military fortress and became the undisputed spiritual heart of the nation. From that day forward, the identities of Jerusalem, Palestine, and the Jewish people became inextricably fused. Under David and his son, Solomon, the kingdom expanded to its greatest extent, a regional power stretching from Egypt to the Euphrates. This was the Golden Age, a time of prosperity and influence that future generations would look back upon with profound longing. Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, a magnificent structure that became the center of Jewish worship, anchoring their faith to that specific piece of land. But prosperity is fragile. The seeds of division were sown in the soil of that very success. Heavy taxes and forced labor, required for Solomon's ambitious building projects, created deep resentment among the tribes. When Solomon died, the unified kingdom shattered. 10 tribes in the north broke away to form the kingdom of Israel. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal in the south, forming the kingdom of Judah. This schism was a historical catastrophe. Palestine went from a regional power to two weak rival kingdoms, caught precariously between the rising empires of Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south. The prophets of the time issued stark warnings. If the people abandoned their faith and justice, the land itself would be taken from them. That prophecy would become a brutal reality. In 722 BC, the mighty Assyrian Empire swept down and obliterated the northern kingdom. Its 10 tribes were deported and scattered across the empire, vanishing from the pages of history, becoming the legendary 10 lost tribes. The northern lands of Palestine were repopulated with foreigners. The small southern kingdom of Judah survived for another century, a lone remnant of the Golden Age, before it faced the wrath of the next great superpower, Babylon. In 586 BC, the sky over Jerusalem burned. The armies of the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, tore down its walls, reduced Solomon's magnificent temple to rubble, and dragged the elite of the nation away in chains. This was more than a military defeat. It was a theological crisis. The promised land was now a smoldering ruin. The chosen people were exiles, weeping by the rivers of Babylon. For the first time, the concept of losing the land became a deep, collective trauma etched into the Jewish soul. Yet, in this darkness, their identity was reforged once more. Without a temple, their faith turned inward, focusing on the preservation of their sacred texts, the Torah. They learned that even if the land was lost, the promise could be carried in their hearts and in their scriptures. A nation could exist in memory. Hope flickered when the Persian Empire conquered Babylon. In an unprecedented act, King Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to return and rebuild their temple. But the Palestine they returned to was not the same. It was now a minor province in a vast empire, a land of mixed peoples where Samaritans and Arab tribes had established their own presence. The fragile peace was shattered by a storm from the west. Alexander the Great. The arrival of the Greeks brought a wave of Hellenistic culture, philosophy, and lifestyle. This clash of civilizations culminated under the reign of Antiochus IV, who desecrated the rebuilt temple, sparking the Maccabean Revolt, a brief, fiery moment of Jewish independence. It was the last glimmer of light before the shadow of the world's greatest empire fell across the land, Rome. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem. Palestine was now a pawn on the imperial chessboard of Rome. This was the era of Herod the Great, a client king known for his monumental architecture and his brutal paranoia. It was into this tense world of Roman occupation and Jewish messianic expectation that a figure was born who would change the course of global history, Jesus of Nazareth. The New Testament paints a picture of a land simmering with religious and political tension. Many hoped for a Messiah who would be a warrior king, one who would expel the Romans and restore the glorious kingdom of David. The path of nonviolence and sacrifice chosen by Jesus gave birth to Christianity, a faith that would soon make Palestine a holy land for billions more around the world. But the conflict with Rome only escalated. A massive Jewish revolt in 66 AD was met with overwhelming Roman force. In 70 AD, the general Titus did what the Babylonians had done 6 centuries earlier. He leveled Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. All that remains today is its western retaining wall, the Wailing Wall, the holiest site in modern Judaism. The final, fatal blow came after another failed revolt in 132 AD. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, determined to crush the Jewish spirit of resistance once and for all, enacted a policy of cultural erasure. He banned Jews from Jerusalem, built a Roman city on its ruins, and, in a final, calculated act of humiliation, he officially renamed the province of Judea. He called it Syria Palestina. He named it after the Philistines, the ancient enemies of the Israelites, to sever the Jewish connection to the land in name, as he had in fact. From this moment, the name Palestine entered the world's official vocabulary, just as the Jewish people began their great dispersal, the diaspora, an exile that would last nearly 2,000 years. As the Roman Empire split, Palestine fell under the control of its eastern Byzantine half. It became a thoroughly Christian land, dotted with churches and monasteries from Bethlehem to Nazareth, a primary destination for pilgrims. Then, in the 7th century, another world-altering force emerged from the deserts of Arabia: Islam. In 637, the Caliph Umar entered Jerusalem. The Islamic conquest was, compared to that of the Romans, relatively peaceful. Christians and the small remaining Jewish community were allowed to practice their faiths. On the Temple Mount, the site of the destroyed Jewish temples, Muslims built one of their holiest shrines, the Dome of the Rock, commemorating the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. Jerusalem was now the third holiest city in Islam. Over the next several centuries, under a succession of Islamic dynasties, the demographic and cultural fabric of Palestine was profoundly transformed. Arabic became the common language, and Islam the majority religion. The people living on this land, a mix of original inhabitants, converts, and Arab migrants, became the direct ancestors of modern-day Palestinians. The story of Palestine in the Bible had now entered a new phase. It was no longer a struggle between ancient tribes, but a complex intersection of the world's great monotheistic faiths. Each now had an unbreakable spiritual bond to this single small territory. The Jew, holding the promise of the Torah; the Christian, walking the path of Jesus; the Muslim, honoring the journey of the Prophet. This convergence would become tragically combustible when, in the 11th century, armies of crusaders from Europe arrived to reclaim the Holy Land, opening a bloody new chapter of faith, conquest, and memory, a chapter whose echoes still reverberate in the conflicts of today. For 400 years, from 1517 onwards, Palestine was a relatively quiet corner of the vast Ottoman Empire. Under the sultans in Istanbul, it was not a single entity, but a collection of districts administered from Syria or Beirut. A multi-ethnic society persisted, with wealthy Arab families, peasant farmers, and small, devout Jewish communities in the four holy cities of Jerusalem: Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. But in the 19th century, the world began to change. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, European powers grew more interested in the region. Simultaneously, a new idea was taking root among the Jewish communities of Europe, who were facing waves of violent anti-Semitism. This idea was Zionism, the belief that the Jewish people would never be safe without a national home of their own, and that home could only be in one place: Zion, the biblical land of Israel, Palestine. Starting in the 1880s, the first waves of Jewish immigrants began arriving, buying land and establishing new settlements. For them, it was the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream, a return from an impossibly long exile. But for the Arab population who had lived there for dozens of generations, it was an alarming development. They saw these new arrivals not as returning family, but as a foreign presence that threatened their land, their culture, and their future. Two powerful national narratives were set on a collision course. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed in World War I, Britain took control of Palestine. In a fateful series of contradictory promises, they offered independence to the Arabs in exchange for their help in the war, while also issuing the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Under the British mandate, Jewish immigration surged, especially as Nazism rose in Europe. Tensions exploded into violence. The Arab population saw themselves losing control of their homeland. The Jewish population, with the horror of the Holocaust fresh in their minds, saw the creation of a state as a matter of life and death. In 1947, A war-weary Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed a solution: partition. The plan was to divide Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem as an international city. The Jewish leadership accepted, seeing it as the only path to realizing the biblical promise. The Arab world vehemently rejected it as an unjust seizure of their land. In May 1948, as the last British soldiers departed, Israel declared its independence. Immediately, 5 Arab armies invaded. For Israelis, it was their war of independence. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands fled or were forced from their homes, becoming refugees. The biblical promise and the geopolitical reality had finally collided, creating a wound in the map and in the hearts of two peoples that has been bleeding ever since. The 1967 Six-Day War redrew the map once again, with Israel capturing the West Bank, Gaza, and, crucially, East Jerusalem, including the Old City. Millions of Palestinians now lived under Israeli military occupation. The conflict entered a new, grinding phase of uprisings, settlements, and seemingly endless cycles of violence. Looking back across this immense 4,000-year journey, we are left with a painful paradox. In the Bible, Palestine is the promised land, a symbol of peace, blessing, and divine favor. In reality, it has been one of history's most blood-soaked battlegrounds. It seems the more sacred the land becomes, the higher the price paid in human life. Today, we see a land of concrete walls and checkpoints, of ancient hatreds and youthful despair. One people, the Israelis, hold the Bible and their ancestral history as their claim to self-determination in their ancient homeland. The other people, the Palestinians, hold the keys to the homes their grandparents fled and the memory of continuous presence as their claim to justice. Both narratives are powerful. Both are rooted in genuine love for the same small piece of land. Both are steeped in generations of trauma. So, can a 4,000-year-old text serve as a land deed in the 21st century? For people of faith, God's promise is eternal. For international law and geopolitics, the reality is infinitely more complex. The truth of Palestine in the Bible is not just the story of a chosen people. It is a universal lesson about the collision of memory and reality, about the danger of exclusive claims to a shared holy space. The ancient pages of the Bible are still being written today, not in ink, but in the blood and tears of the people who live there. Perhaps the solution lies not in redrawing borders on a map, but in rereading the sacred texts themselves to see if the promise of a holy land can ever be separated from the dream of a peaceful one. Perhaps one day, the land of promise can finally become a land of peace, as its first people had always dreamed. O divine mystery, breath of life beneath the ancient dust, awaken our hearts from the illusion of empire. Where there is violence, plant the seeds of radical compassion. Teach us to see the Holy Land not as territory to conquer, but as the sacred presence within every human soul. Amen.